Good to see you all. So let me just start with an acknowledgement, which is, I guess, my own, an examination of my own hubris. When bank tellers started to get replaced by ATMs, I saw it happen, but it was a convenience, so I didn't do anything about it. When I started to see that gas station attendants were getting replaced by paying at the pump, I saw that happen too. And I guess I felt badly that people were losing their jobs, but I didn't do anything about it. When I started to see that there were less checkout people in the grocery store and we were starting to scan our own, saw that happen too. And, I don't remember protesting about it. Then they came for me, and all of a sudden AI started suggesting that it could write screenplays, and I got up in arms. That's my own hubris, and I think everybody in the Writers Guild felt it. And it was certainly part of a huge part of the negotiation that John was just a part of that closed this week. We're going to talk about everything having to do with AI that we can fit into the time allowed. I want to talk about it as a threat. I want to talk about it as an opportunity. I want to talk about different versions of it. There's ethical AI, and then there's, I hate to say it, unethical AI. I want to talk about what government's role should be. I want to talk about who we should give this awesome force to, who should be able to control it, and what do guilds have to say about that. There's a lot of ground to cover. It seems like we should start, Bill, with you, with, if you could, just sort of a brief description of where AI came from.
Sure. And
what different iterations of it exist now.
Yeah. So AI actually has been with us for a long time. Back in 1956, there was a conference held at Dartmouth where it brought together academics who were interested in, could you program a computer to do things that, when people do it, it's thought to require intelligence. So things like solve a puzzle, beat you at a game of chess, be able to understand natural language. And at that conference, the term artificial intelligence was coined. Early AI efforts really focused on trying to use logic and rules. So you'd have a rule that might say, if the patient's temperature is over 98.6, conclude they've got a fever. The going was slow initially because people had to build systems by hand, taking lots and lots of those rules to produce something that started to behave in a way that kind of looked intelligent. Nevertheless, there were some significant achievements. In the 70s at Stanford, for example, there was a program called MISON that was put together that could diagnose infectious diseases, particularly septicemia, and prescribe therapies for it at about at the level of an expert clinician. But these systems were quite fragile because of this use of logic. So, if you have a patient who is at 98.5, you say they don't have a fever. If they're at 98.9, you say they do have a fever. Most people would see those as being kind of similar. Computer didn't see that. The other big thing that was holding things back was that real people had to write all these rules and get these things to work, and that was a tedious process. Later, particularly starting around the 2000s, the idea of using neural nets really came to the fore. And this is the idea that you've got a network of nodes, you've got some inputs that go into it, and at each node a computation is done to figure out whether this node should fire, that is, pass on its outputs other information. And ultimately, these systems were used for things like classifying images, deciding that something is, this is a picture of a dog or a cat. And the big advantage that these systems had was that you could use data to actually automatically program the network and improve the network. So you'd take lots and lots of data, lots and lots of pictures of dogs and cats, and that were marked, whether they were dogs or cats, and then train the network on this and get it to produce really quite good results. Later, people extended this idea of neural nets to be able to handle sequences of inputs. So, you might have a word sequence, for example, and they could compute from these sequences what's the next most likely word. So this word appears, then this word appears, then this word appears. Okay, this is the word that's most likely to appear next. And you've probably seen that in email systems that you use now, where you'll be typing a note like, unfortunately I cannot, and then it completes, attend your party, or whatever. It's that idea that is behind the kinds of systems like ChatGPT that we see now. But what has happened over and above just the simple email thing that adds additional words to what you're typing, the representations have improved so they have a much better understanding of the context in which this sentence appears, and the algorithms have improved so that it's possible to train on a much larger set of data, and the processing, the computers have improved so that we can now take in much, much more and train these systems. And that's why you can see the kind of outputs that you get out of ChatGPT, which are actually quite impressive. But it's important to understand that the system does not actually understand what it's producing in a way that we would recognize as being understanding. And so it's just producing the most likely next thing.
It seems to me, Lisa, that every company that is developing some sort of open AI is currently being sued for copyright infringement. Can you take us through what those suits look like and what you think the likely outcomes are and what that will ultimately mean?
Yes, there's a lot of litigation. I think right now there's at least 7 pending cases, and it's probably more today since it was yesterday. But there's the Authors Guild, and with many notable writers, John Grisham and other best-selling authors are suing OpenAI and other platforms. Sarah Silverman has sued OpenAI again. OpenAI seems to be the most prevalent one that people are suing. But all Stability AI, OpenAI, ChatGPT, they're all being sued by these creators because these AI models are being trained, which most of us know maybe, but they're being trained by pulling all of this information from the web. And so they're taking these copyrightable works or copyrighted works, pulling them into their AI models and training them to output new information. And so these authors and these creators are saying, that's not fair. You can't take my stuff and train this AI model to do something that's based on my work. To back up a little bit, copyright is somebody's ability to almost have a monopoly on their work, to say, this is my work, I have the ability to copy it, to create derivative works, to perform it, to display it. And when these AI models are now pulling that and creating what, in essence, could be a derivative work, creators are not very happy about that. And what it's really going to fall on is whether courts decide, well, is this a fair use? Sort of like Google. There was a Google Books case where the court decided, yes, Google is taking all of these books and inputting them into their system, but the purpose for doing that is really transformative, which is a key word for fair use. It's very transformative. We're now using it so people can search. We're not using it so that people can steal your book and plagiarize it. So in that case, the court determined that that was a fair use, the way Google was pulling full text of books so that people could then search. Here, it's going to rely on that. Are the courts going to determine that it's a fair use, or are they going to determine that it's a copyright infringement? AI is very different. They are creating a derivative work where Google is not really doing that. So I imagine the courts are going to say it's an infringement, but I don't know, and it will be very interesting. There was actually recently a case, it was one of the first cases that was filed, which interestingly was about a legal platform, Westlaw, which has a digital database of all of the cases with an outline kind of format with keynotes and numbering system. And another AI platform came and took their head notes and their outlining and said, hey, and used it in their AI model to train it. Westlaw sued, and the court now is letting that go to trial. So that trial is actually supposed to go forward in May of 2024. So I only want to find out for a little bit because court systems are slow, but it will be interesting to see how that turns out.
So this is a question for anybody. As Paul mentioned, I have a podcast, and one of the guests that I had on the podcast, we talked about AI quite a bit during the course of the Writers Guild strike. And one of the guys that I had on is a guy who had created his own AI to launch his own app, but he created what he calls ethical AI. In other words, AI that can attribute sources, which seems to me to be vital. If you don't have AI that can attribute sources, in other words, that can say, well, yeah, I stole this, but I stole it from a John August screenplay, and here are the page numbers. And if Hollywood starts to use AI in an irresponsible way, aren't we walking into a world in which Disney is going to be suing Paramount because Paramount's AI stole something from Disney without proper accreditation, and Warner Brothers is suing Comcast for the same reason? How's anybody going to get anything done? It's a question for anybody. And is that just part and parcel of AI if it's not ethical AI?
I know I just spoke, but
Please
I'd
do.
like to like to address this because this is something that we talk about in our office a lot. We represent a lot of nonfiction filmmakers, and right now the way in which they're using it is to create new images or to take an image that's not great and make it better. And so they're pulling from these sources, and they always ask us, is this okay? Is this okay? And we kind of say, well, I don't know. Is it okay? And so, but one of the things that we're advising clients to do is now use from these platforms that are only training their models with licensed content, like Adobe is doing. So we're saying, well, Adobe's doing this, they're only pulling from licensed content, and many of those platforms are actually indemnifying the end user by saying, if you get an IP claim, we're going to cover you because we're confident that what we've pulled from is not infringing. And so I think the more and more we can steer people towards using authorized content from these platforms that are using licensed material, the better off we'll be.
Okay, so this is a question for Alton and for Jay because we happen to be speaking about it backstage. I want to talk about, I think, one of the facets of AI that we haven't yet talked about in the town square, which is the inherent biases of AI. Mm-hmm. Human beings create content on the web. AI web scrapes, sort of tokenizing ones and zeros just indiscriminately, which means that AI is inherently inheriting the biases of the human beings who created that content. And we're now starting to see that AI is inheriting racism, inheriting sexism, and then propagating it and amplifying it in a way that I didn't see coming. Can you talk about examples you've seen of that, how that has manifested, the dangers of it?
Yeah, that's how I started into the journey of AI was trying to understand how it would affect already marginalized groups, and with civic technologies like facial recognition, identifying someone because of certain, an algorithm, right, and them getting locked up or something like that. As a storyteller, I was intrigued by, predictive policing algorithms, things like that, right? And we did a project called POV, Points of View, about the future of law enforcement technologies and implicit bias in AI, and what would be like if instead of getting a ankle bracelet, you get a drone, AI drone, when you get out as a parole officer, and we were learning about how this AI might perceive you as data, right? If I go in and I have a certain record, right? Mm-hmm. When I get out, is it going to contribute to the recidivism? If this algorithm will say, okay, I'm going to commit a crime by this time if I'm around these types of people because it has all of this data around this community. So that's what opened up the rabbit hole for us to go down learning about it and then seeing how it really was a big problem, right? How it is a threat to not just the people who are going to prison or getting out of, formerly incarcerated, but even your privacy as a whole, right? What you give up and how you might be surveilled with these algorithms, with that technology. So that's how it all started, and you're seeing that it's continued to grow at a much faster rate than when we got into it in like 2017 to what it is now, where, like you said, it can grab something on you and like recommend something, but it's detrimental now to where we're headed, just your civil liberties in general. So that's my take on it now from what I've learned so far as going down that pathway.
Jay? I think the bias exists right now. You can go to, anyone of us can do this, you can go into Midjourney or DALL-E 2 and just type in a prompt if you want to see an image, and you could say, generate an image of, a doctor standing in front of a stop sign.
Right.
I bet you 90% of the time you're going to get a white guy. Right? And so you kind of think, well, wait, that's not what I was looking for. So you have to start becoming very explicit and more explicit in your prompts to get that. So the bias is actually there now.
Right.
And I think that,
If you said generate an image of a criminal in front of a stop sign, would that
Yes.
person most likely be a person of color?
I would guess so. I've not tried it, but it would be great to do a demo up here to find out what it's really doing. But
Maybe not so great.
But again, not so great. But again, I think even, and I can't speak to this with detail, but it was a couple of years ago, I think, that Microsoft let a couple of their bots start to, and William, you could probably speak more to it,
Right.
go at it. And it, within a matter of days, I think, maybe even shorter, it started to become more anti-Semitic and more misogynistic and more sexist and more racist because there's so much of that online.
Right. It was
So-
what happened was they put this bot out there and said to the world, "Okay, world, interact with this." And people who were of a more radical side started interacting with it, and suddenly it started acquiring a lot of their attitudes and perceptions, and so became very racist and very, really, and Microsoft shut it down just a couple of days after bringing it out. And the lesson really here is, there's an old saying in computer science, garbage in, garbage out. It's this in spades. So basically, these systems acquire the trait of whatever data they're trained on, and so what we really need to do is be, I think, much more careful on the kind of data that we are exposing the systems to and using them to train them. Just as with our kids, we would be careful about what we allow them to see or who we allow them to interact with. But developing the technology that allows that kind of filtering is actually still a research topic, still something that has to be done.
I want to talk about that duty to care. Yeah, I can see by the faces out there that none of you are old enough to know this reference, but I am. And we used to say something was a copy of a copy. There used to be a thing called a Xerox machine, and you'd make copies of pieces of paper on it, and every time you made a copy of a copy, it just degraded a little bit. It got a little bit less sharp, a little bit worse. And so a copy of a copy was a universal expression that we would use. And I think about that a lot when I think about AI, that AI is a copy of us, and therefore will inherently take so much of what is wrong with us because who's online, right? So John, I want to kick this specifically to you. You were part of the negotiating committee for the WGA. Thank you. Brilliant job in the face of relentless and deep-pocketed opposition. And we could do a separate panel on that, but I want to talk about just the AI piece. A couple questions. How educated were you about AI at the beginning of the process? What was the learning curve to learn about AI? What were you at first getting back from the companies? It felt from the outside like they were saying, we're just not discussing this. This is a technology that none of us are sure yet what it's going to turn into. So come back to us in 3 years when it's a fully mature thing, and then we'll talk. And obviously, that was not going to be acceptable. And what did it take to make the companies, who I refuse to call the AMPTP, by the way, I just will not. They're not producers, they're studios, so I call them the AMPTS. And I think we all should. Producers are friends of mine, by the way. Producers help me get movies made. That's not the people that were in that room. But anyway, aside from that, what did it take to make the member companies of that alliance understand the guardrails and protections that writers and more broadly the entire business needed from AI?
So the story of the WGA and AI really starts about 18 months ago. I was approached by two bloggers who said, hey, we really want to show you something. And what they were showing me is like, we're writing a screenplay, but we're having AI write a screenplay for us. And so they shared their Zoom screen. They showed like, we're having, it's pre-chat GPT, so it was really kind of rudimentary, but it was GPT 2 or whatever that was. And they're saying, oh, so we're having a scene, we're telling what we want to happen in the scene, and it generates it, and we paste it back in. And it was terrible. I mean, it really was bad. It was like magnetic poetry bad. And yet, there was something that was concerning there, because initially, I was worried, like, okay, well, is this copyrightable? Who gets credit on this? Like, what is this even going to mean or do? So I went to the guild and I said, listen, this sounds crazy, but I think we need to figure out some policies for, screenplays and other things that are not written by a human being. And they said, probably we do, and also we have a negotiation coming up, so we should be thinking about that as a negotiating issue. So the WGA board put together a committee to really study the topic and figure out what kind of policies did we need to put in place. And really, you can divide them into two big buckets. One is, what are the protections we need in for writers' kind of daily workflow? How do we make sure that AI isn't fucking up our credits, our pay, our compensation, our residuals? How do we protect that stuff? And so, fortunately, we're going into this MBA negotiation with the companies, and we said, okay, well, material generated by AI is not literary material, which is a defined term, which is the things that Billy and I write, screenplays, treatments, outlines. It's also not source material. It's not like a John Grisham book you're hired to adapt. So if someone hands you something generated by AI, it doesn't count as really anything. It's like printing out a Wikipedia article. It's not the basis of anything meaningful. So those were crucial protections. But we were also thinking about what I call the Nora Ephron problem. It's like, what if you input all of Nora Ephron's scripts into the system and it generates a new Nora Ephron script that's based on all her material? That's the training problem, and we had to figure out, like, well, how are we going to address those in this negotiation? So we went into our normal negotiations, and those AI proposals were part of it, and they just refused to talk to us about them for the 6 or 7 weeks of negotiation. And at the very last day, they said, okay, we'll agree to have a meeting with you twice a year about AI, and that was it. And that was not satisfactory. And ultimately, they realized that they really should not have done that, because it elevated AI as a concern, not just for us, but for Directors Guild, for all the other guilds, for Screen Actors Guild. Everyone said, like, oh shit, the studios are planning to do something here, and we have to be ready for this. We went out on strike. Directors Guild made a deal that was not great on AI, but it had at least defined that a director is a human being, sure, and agreed to meetings in the future. Screen Actors Guild went out on strike, and the AI issues were significant for them. They have concerns about the protection of their likeness, their voice, their ability, their performances. They don't want to, they are the most vulnerable to being replaced by AI synthetic performers. Ultimately, when we went back into the room with the studios, we were able to get them to come back with a comprehensive plan for AI, and that we were able to negotiate on, that would protect our workflow. So, like, it's not literary material, it's not source material, but also consent. So they have to disclose if any material is generated by AI to us. We have the right to say no, that we can't, that we aren't required to use those tools, and that we can use them if the companies agree to it. And I think a lot of companies will probably say no. Basically, companies, I think, will say they don't want us to use AI tools because they're worried about copyright infringement, which they should be. We have members who come to us and say, listen, I don't want to come anywhere near AI because I consider it stolen material. And that's fair, and so we need to protect our members over those issues. Ultimately, where we came to with the training issue is that we needed to protect our ability to assert that that they cannot do things with our existing material. The companies own copyright on the stuff we write for them, but we control certain other rights called separated rights, and those may be very crucial for us being able to defend ourselves from adaptations of our work. So we sort of mutually agreed not to argue over this point at this moment, but that doesn't mean the end of the work, because this deal we made with the companies is only binding, us to these studios. OpenAI, Microsoft, Facebook, they're not parties to this contract. And so the real work going forward is on policy, on legal issues, trying to make sure that writers are protected no matter where this material is being generated. In terms of your question, like, why did they suddenly get serious? It's because we were out on strike for 5 months. That's really what it was. It was just our power that forced them back to the table on this issue. And I think was a wake-up call to a lot of other industries. And while every industry is going to have its own specific concerns over AI, I think the two general principles that apply is that AI should not be replacing a human worker, and that AI should not be used to drive down the wages and working conditions of the human worker. And that kind of applies across all industries. And so that's the work going forward, I think, also, is making sure that other places that can do fight over these kind of issues.
I had AI as a guest on my podcast twice, and I asked it, do you feel you could write a screenplay? And it said yes. And I said, do you feel you could be a CEO of Warner Brothers? And it said yes. Do you feel you could be a teacher? And it said yes. I said, have you ever listened to this podcast before? And it said no. I said, but now having been a guest, do you feel you could be the host of this podcast? And it said yes. And I said, have you ever been in love? And it said no. I said, have you ever had a child? No. Ever held anybody's hand? No. Do you have a sense of humor? It said yes. I said, knock, knock. And it said, who's there? And I said, Ach. And it said, Ach who? And I said, God bless you. And it said, well, not being a person, I don't know what it's like to sneeze, but thank you. And I said, well, I guess we just answered the fucking sense of humor question. Okay.
That is wild.
So, episode 5. There are 4 means of counteracting corporations when they start doing things that are not in the interest of the public at large. There is consumer protest, happens very rarely. There is stockholder protest, happens very rarely. There is collective bargaining, which we just saw, which is sometimes the only option that's open. But there's also governmental regulation, which is critical in something the size of AI. We've seen now in Sacramento a very real attempt on the part of the California government to rein in AI. Just passed a bill. It's stunning to me that this had to be a bill, but it is a bill that says that if a truck is over 10,000 pounds, it must have a person aboard to drive it, who is not called a truck driver in this bill. It's called a human safety operator. And what that essentially means is that the companies who ship things by truck want the right to use driverless trucks, AI. And at least now we know some human being with a beating heart is going to be in that cab. That gives me some comfort. Why we had to legislate it is another issue. But even though that's happening in California, as long as Kevin McCarthy is swinging a gavel in D.C., seems unlikely to impossible that the federal government is going to step in on this issue at all. And the term they use in D.C. is we're pro-innovation, which always means whatever business wants to do, we're just going to let them do it without regulation at all. So this is a question for all of you because it impacts each of you in your own way, either as creators, lawyers, academics, or business people. What is the appropriate role of government in regulating something as awe-inspiring as AI and potentially dangerous? And I'd like to hear from each of you on this one.
Okay. So I think it's essential. I think, if we look at everything else in terms of technology that's out there that has both the potential for significant good as well as significant harm, there is usually by now some sort of federal agency that's regulating it. We can talk about airplanes, for example.
Sure.
Airplanes without regulation would be really pretty scary. But we're all reasonably comfortable getting on an airplane because we know it's been certified. We know that the crew has been certified. The people who work on it have been certified. And there are standards that they all have to maintain. I think the same sort of thing has to happen on for AI. And I think it's really one of the things that's critical that we were just talking about is how do we make sure that people's intellectual property is respected and compensated fairly? And I think that's part of the regulation issue. How do we make sure that people aren't, or companies aren't doing things with AI to generate misinformation, which, in the coming election could be a big issue. Again, I think regulation and consequences have to be in place to prevent bad behaviors. And really, regulation, the benefit of it is that it allows companies that want to do the right thing to be able to do so without having to bear an economic cost. I just think if we don't have regulation, this is going to be a huge mess.
Yeah, I would just say from a content and Hollywood perspective, it's really the Copyright Office that's going to have to be at the forefront here, because I do believe that if they maintain the line that human authorship is a requirement for copyrightability, that studios and individuals are going to be reluctant to put a lot of resources into something that when they publish it, it's, written and directed by AI or ChatGPT. It's not going to have any protection. It's in the public domain right away, and anyone else can take it and create a derivative work. So I do think the Copyright Office is going to have a big role in that, in drawing that line and making sure that AI-created elements remain in the public domain and don't have copyrightability. And I'm hopeful that will deter people from creating that. So I think the Copyright Office is going to have a big say in this, and they have recently reached out to sort of the public for a request for comment, and they have a list of like 30 questions where they're looking for people in these industries to talk about these different areas and what areas of the law currently impact AI, and what about the right of publicity, and all of these other elements that that they're looking for comment on, because I think they anticipate that they're going to have to act.
I'm hopeful, but I'm not sure I would rely on the government too soon, because it's been out, like you were saying, so long, right? And AI has been a solution creating its own problem for quite some time. So I think that there are other areas, I think, that could be tackled. Like, I think storytellers have a big responsibility in this too, of bringing that awareness so that the government can say, okay, I see other areas how this could impact. I think storytelling has been a big component of bringing things to light for government and other places, right? But it's going to take some time and some impact, like you said, and being adaptable during this time for everybody to push that awareness to the government to make a big push.
Yeah, I think
I just want to say, Jay, I'll get you in 1 second, Bill. There's a word that I learned called optimization, which is a Silicon Valley word. And optimization essentially means that whatever you have to do as a business to drive down cost, human cost, and up profit, you just do it. And when you're dealing with the Amazons of the world, they're famously anti-union and famously pro-optimization. So Jay, doing what you do, AI can put a lot of people out of work, and that would be optimal, right? In terms of business, but maybe not in terms of humanity, maybe not in terms of developing the bench of the young artists who are supposed to learn how to do what you do so that they can do it 20 years from now, and maybe not in terms of actual delivery to the consumer. So can you touch on that?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for that. It's kind of like you're reading my mind. I am part of an industry in the entertainment industry, in the visual effects world, we are not unionized. We never have been, and it's happening now because of very similar things. But it's been kind of a slight soapbox here. It's been a nonstop exploitation since I've been in like 30 years. And it is constantly this, optimization, optimization, optimization. It is do more for less, do more for less, do more for less. We don't really care about the artistry. We don't care about the skills, the training that comes. Just get it done and make it look pretty good. And so AI, what's weird about this is I'm involved in development of AI tools at the same time that is like crushing my own work. And so it feels, I feel like I'm in a hamster wheel a little bit, kind of just looking left and right. It's like, that's cool. This is terrible. What are we doing? Oh, I'm still alive. It's okay. I just some water. It's moving so fast that I'm hopeful, but I'm also very concerned, because let's say a very mundane task like rotoscoping in our industry, which is tracing around an actor or an object if you don't shoot something on green screen and you still want to put a giant environment in, or remove wires from somebody hanging. There are tools now that artists used to be able to do, take a week to get a shot done, can be done in an afternoon, unaided by a person except typing in and moving some folders around. So it's of great concern. I think workers' rights and the preservation of jobs is actually maybe one of the biggest things, in addition to protecting IP. and creativity. We've been scanning actors in my business for 25 years or so. William's been part of some of this initial stuff, and actors are very concerned about using their likenesses. That's honestly, as a supervisor and an artist, the last thing I want to do is recreate an actor. I have zero interest in it. But studios are coming to us and saying, hey, what's it going to take, like if in season 6 of the show we want to bring an actor back at that old age, and these questions are coming up, and we're kind of going, whoa, this is, we're getting into some scary territory here. So I don't have an answer for that part, but there's so much, a feeling of so much incubation is happening. Like there's stuff happening behind the scenes right now that we're going to be in 6 months going, oh my God, remember when we were on stage and we didn't even think this was going to happen? That's the little bit of the fear that I have.
Another of the expressions that I learned without wanting to in the last 5 months was a prompt jockey. A prompt jockey is a person who utilizes AI. They're not artists, they're not writers, they're prompt jockeys. They just tell AI what to do, and AI does the work. And I don't want to go see a movie made by a bunch of prompt jockeys. I mean, that may be just me. But the original question, John, was
sort of the edge of
what is the appropriate role of government to regulate something like AI? And when you were inside the bunker, and by the way, folks, just so you know, because none of you have had this experience, I was the co-chair of the negotiating committee for the Writers Guild 3 times, so I've lived it. It all takes place in the Sherman Oaks Galleria. It's so batty. You park at the Galleria, and then you go into the suite that's owned by the AMPTS, and you go to the left, which is the Writers' Caucus Room, and to the right is the Alliance's Caucus Room, and they cater lunch. One time in 2017, the negotiations had already broken down once, and they were pretty conflictual. And the second time they broke down, the head of the AMPTS, Carol Lombardini, canceled the catering to our caucus room, told us to leave, and then released something erroneously to the press that we had stormed out of negotiations. Like little chicken shit stuff like that just happens again and again and again. But the point is, when you're in the middle of that, okay, of course there is a part of you saying, where's the government? Like, surely the government has to step in and see the danger of this so that we don't march ourselves into a jobless economy. And it feels like what the Writers Guild did became sort of the front line in a much larger conversation about the corporatization of America, the worth of the individual, the power of unions, the dignity of work. What do you think the government's role should be?
So as the Guild, we think the government's role should be significant. And so some of the things we've been doing in addition to negotiating this contract, I testified before the Office of Copyright on behalf of the Guild, arguing sort of our case that material generated by AI should not be copyrightable, and therefore, and in any event, no matter, we shouldn't just be thinking about the corporations who control copyright, but also thinking about the authors who actually created it, and that material generated by AI has no author and therefore is not subject to copyright. Just making sure we remember the actual authors and artists behind these works. We've been talking with the FTC. I'm talking with the FTC next week about sort of antitrust concerns and overall competitiveness concerns over AI. There's another branch of this. Meredith Steen, our president, went to DC and testified before a Senate committee right next to Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg and Sam Altman of OpenAI, talking about not just writers' concerns, but all artists' concerns, and making sure that we're remembering the people who are actually making this work that's at risk here. So government and policy is going to be an incredibly important part of this, but government moves slowly, and this is also, again, only the US government we can talk about, and these tools are being used all over the world. In many cases, these tools are open source, and so, yes, the models are incredibly expensive to train and build, and only a couple giant companies can do that, but the actual people who can use these tools, it's kind of like the script kiddies who can sort of mess up whole sectors of our economy. That is going to be a real ongoing problem. It's going to be a huge live issue and concern. So there's not going to be, the government itself is not going to be able to stop it. But I'd like to piggyback on something that Jay said, is that I think as us in this audience, many of us are filmmakers, we are going to be confronted on a daily basis by concerns about, is it cool for me to be using this AI tool? This is really handy, but is this fair for me to be using? An example from my own life is going out to pitch a project, and there's, classically when you pitch, you make a deck to pitch a project, you pull images from other old movies to sort of show what things look like. And we've all kind of accepted that that's just a thing you do. And that feels fair. It's like fair use-ish. But if I were to, if that image doesn't exist and I use Stable Diffusion or one of these other tools to create the image I need, okay, is that fair? Is that ethical? Is it fair and ethical for me to use it for my own purposes? But if I'm using this in a deck to set up and sell a project, is that ethical? We're going to be facing those kind of concerns again and again and again. And so just like you're figuring out with visual effects, we're going to be always having to ask ourselves, is this appropriate? Am I replacing a human worker by doing this kind of thing? Would I have hired a storyboard artist to do this thing? Am I using a tool that is basically creating stolen property? Those are the things we're going to have to ask ourselves, and I think actually say no to at times, and not use them out of convenience, just the same way we don't go to, the self-checkout line at times to sort of keep things to maintain the humanity in the system.
Well, I kept feeling, for me, and I'll kick it to you next, Bill. For me, I know that if you're writing a screenplay that you can say to AI, give me 12 ways to rob a bank, and it can do it, right? And that's a modern convenience that I would never use at the point of a gun, speaking of banks. I just wouldn't do it. It would feel like cheating to me, and I have enough imposter syndrome already. I don't need more. But I know for sure that I want the power to regulate that in the hands of the Writers Guild and not in the hands of the companies that employ us. That I know for a fact, because the truth is, and I'm a capitalist to my core, but capitalism is a voracious animal, and it only knows how to seek profit. And if you put that kind of awesome goddamn power in the hands of Comcast that's trying to buy Warner Brothers anyway, what are the chances that it's going to be used in an ethical and prudent manner? It's just not the nature of the companies, and I think that was the beachhead that was so important about the negotiations, that control of it had to be derived from the writers themselves. Anyway, I cut you off. Go back to where you were.
Let's see. So I think in terms of regulation, I'm actually thinking that there needs to be almost an agency stood up that deals with this. I think if we try to do this piecemeal within the confines of existing agencies, like the Copyright Office, which fine office for sure, but I think we won't wind up with a comprehensive solution. I also think that it really has to be done through regulation in a agency kind of setting, as opposed to having Congress pass a bunch of laws, because Congress is not really up to speed on all of this stuff and wouldn't really result in I think, a happy outcome on this. So just a couple of thoughts on this.
The other thing that occurred to me as you were talking, John, is we were talking about running a show, right? If you're running a show on television, and let's just say that AI was unchecked and that corporations could use it in any way they liked. Okay, I break 8 stories for a season of television, and the streamer that I'm working for, if unchecked, says, okay, AI is going to write the first draft of those 8 scripts. They know I'm not going to put that show on the air without rewriting it myself.
Right.
So they're going to get the work out of me.
They're going to use your pride of authorship.
They're going to use my pride
against
of
you.
authorship, and they're going to get 8 scripts by the person they hired. They're going to work me into the ground because they know that there's no way I'm putting something on the air that I don't love. And they don't have to pay any other writers. So they don't have to put any more money into pension and health. So then the pension and health gets weaker of the Writers Guild, and pretty soon the pension and health goes away, and then you have no guild.
It's almost like you anticipated why we needed to have minimum staffing in rooms. So it was part of the other negotiation.
Odd that you should bring that up.
Right.
Okay, so but I have a question for all of you, but I want to throw it at Alton first. Let's now talk about how this impacts the consumer. Let's talk about a world in which AI is so sophisticated and its use becomes so ubiquitous that the cost of it drops, right? So I'm now a 20-year-old male, and I can sit in my house and look at my TV and say, please create Body Heat with me starring opposite Margot Robbie. Okay? That's coming. That's going to be possible. Why the hell would that guy then go and pay $15 to watch Oppenheimer if he can watch that movie instead? That's a massive concern for me. Are we going to make being home so irresistible that no one has to go out anymore? I'd love for you guys to kick that one around, but I'll start with you.
I think that's sort of like the gift and the curse, right? Because it kind of goes back to what you talked about.
That's how you described AI in the first place.
Yeah, right.
Right, it was the solution that creates more problems.
Yeah, correct. Right. So, like when you talked about, bank tellers, right, and things changing. When you look back at social media influencers, and now you can make money on YouTube. They're making millions of dollars, right? So you're talking about an opportunity. The gift is you're going to have a lot more creator economy for people to be able to make things who couldn't go make these blockbuster movies and create a level of playing field. But then you're talking about the behemoth, the giant companies. They're going to, go to where they can cut the dollar if they get impacted. Yeah, they're going to try to get around, like you said, the 8 minimum writers in the room, right? It's going to happen. They're going to scam more people. So there has to be some sort of balance, and that's where the legal thing has to sort of come back to play.
But what do we do if AI gets so sophisticated and so cheap that it becomes the go-to?
Well, that's going to happen. It's already happening now, right? It's people are creating content, at such a fast pace now.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I'm not one to really lean on to say, oh, the government's going to solve all my problems. I do think that this is an area where we need government regulation, but I think so much of it, and I am one of the people that has faith in humanity and people, and that people are going to realize again that it's great to interact with people, and that they want to see a movie that's created by somebody with a backstory, and they like the writer, and they like the director, and they like the producer, and they want that human connection. And so I think it's hard. I mean, that's already happening. Life is so convenient. People can stay home. I have 2 teenagers who are totally fine staying home on the weekend and playing video games. And, they don't need to go out. Like when we were younger, if we wanted to get away from our parents and see our friends, like we had to leave the house. And now they don't have to do that anymore. And so it is, and I think AI is a tool to make that even better and even easier to stay home. And I think that no matter how much government regulation there is, it has to be about humans and raising our children and telling them they got to go out and they got to have experiences and they got to get uncomfortable and they have to learn and grow. But so much of it is going to fall on human responsibility and what we all do with ourselves and with our communities and with our children, regardless of what the laws say.
And those things are impossible to legislate.
Yeah.
Impossible. Yeah, it's all about human responsibility and how you take care of your village.
Bill?
So, I want to throw a little cold water on your vision of the future because I'm
Thank
not
you.
sure.
Body Heat starring Margot Robbie and a 20-year-old guy?
Please do.
Exactly. So the problem is, the history of AI, and I've worked at
By the way,
AI.
for those of you who are young, Body Heat is a movie. Sorry.
Yeah, so the history of AI has been one of initial optimism, typically followed by disappointment. Think of self-driving cars, for example. 2015, I was teaching the Intro to AI course at the master's level at USC, and I was telling the students that, self-driving vehicles really seems like they've got that pretty close to nail. Just a few little tweaks here and there, and we'll be there. And I couldn't have been further wrong. We're still having cars get stuck in cement and up in San Francisco, and a variety of problems with the self-driving vehicles like the Tesla. When you put it in full self-driving mode, it's like people have drawn an analogy to your teenage kid with a learner's permit. And that's why those laws are getting passed in Sacramento about having to have somebody on board because you really can't trust the systems. So,
But understand that there were people lobbying against that law. There were
course
huge moneyed interests that said, no, you don't need a human safety operator in a truck.
My point, though, is that I think there are a number of things that have to be solved before we get to the point that you're talking about that will actually be a movie that anyone would want to watch.
Okay, but Jay, you can create that movie pretty soon, can't you?
Well, if you guys want to take deep dives, go into Reddit And look what's happening with Midjourney and ML and all of that. So people are attempting it now. Thousands of people are attempting it now. We can't make it yet, but the goal is to. I'm not saying I personally am. I actually, my God, please no. But
that's optimization, isn't it?
Optimization, and it is happening. There are people making short films. They are lifeless, but they're also really provocative because you can imagine what the future might be in 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. I mean, I think just a quick thing on our own show, we've set some of our own guardrails up because we do deepfakes. We have public citizens or public figures saying things in our show in a historical context, out of context, in an alt history fashion. We could use text to speech to synthesize that politician's voice.
I had on my show.
No, I know exactly.
I interviewed
chose
AI,
not
and it
to.
did the voices of Morgan Freeman,
Yes.
Emma Watson, Arnold Schwarzenegger,
Yes.
and Chris Rock, and crushed.
No, it is
Like,
there.
It was
but
scary.
We chose to say we actually want to hire voice actors. We don't want to use the machines to do that. We may rely on AI to replace some lips and some lip flap, but the sound is actually going to come from a person impersonating that. So for us, that's an ethical choice we made on the show. Regardless, we're still using deepfake tech. So I think part of it is, I'm kind of with Lisa, like we want to be hopeful and say there's some nice self-regulation we could get into, but there's also the underground, which is like, we don't care about anything. We're going to copy it all. And that's happening in the Reddit dungeons.
Yeah, I mean, to Lisa's point, I think sometimes people may want that sense that like this really was made by a human being. And so I think labeling and sort of like labels you can believe could be really helpful. I will pay extra for organic eggs because I believe they actually genuinely are organic eggs and those chickens were not as horribly mistreated. And I think that could be a thing we see in the, at least in the nearer term for AI. It's basically saying like this stuff was done by AI, and on your show, some disclaimer saying like this was the limit of where these tools were used. And this
The International Thriller Writers Association did a poll on this. They asked their readers, would you want to know if a book had been written by AI? And 97% said yes.
Yeah.
Like a warning label on the
Right.
book. The other thing about, I want to go back to the inherent biases of AI, which has to do with the fallibility of the web, not necessarily its racism and its sexism, which are horrible enough, but just how much the web gets wrong. If you went on Wikipedia and typed in my name, there's a page, and there's a picture of someone who's not me. He kind of looks like me, but it's not me. It's been up for 15 years. And he's handsomer than I am, so I just left the fucking picture up. Like, there's no reason to take it down. But the point is, if you were AI and you wanted to know who I was, that would be your image of me. The not so secret thing about the web is there's no fact checking. Just any asshole can put up anything on the web, and it all of a sudden is out there in the public square, and that's what's being scraped. So where does that lead us?
Can I just say one thing about Wikipedia? Because I have a similar thing on my Wikipedia page where I have 2 sons, and it says, mother to 2 sons, Dylan and Liam, who is her favorite. And somebody pointed that out to me, and I was like, oh my goodness, my son, who was probably at the time 9, went onto my Wikipedia page and put that in there, which I think is fantastic, but also horrifying.
So again, getting back
So
to
what
that.
do we do? I don't know what
A
we do
copy
about
of a copy,
that.
if what it's pulling from is the web, and if the web has no fact checking, then where do we go?
And with things like ChatGPT, it's even worse than that, because ChatGPT doesn't really understand what it's producing. And so it's basically probabilistic. So it's saying this word followed by this word, this one is the next most likely word.
That's a large language model.
It's a large language model. So what that means is that the outputs that it's going to be producing are its best guess as to what would be the most likely thing to say at a particular, which is not necessarily true. And furthermore, it's not really understanding what it's saying in a sense that we would understand, understanding what you're saying.
Right.
It's all statistical. So as a result, it's really even difficult. Even if you did have a database of facts, it would be hard to verify that what it's saying is really factual.
Yeah, and I think that supports.
So it's much worse than what you're saying.
But I think that also, in a sense, it supports what you were saying before, Bill. That everyone has this idea. AI is progressing so quickly. we're going to have that movie, tomorrow, but maybe we won't because of these inaccuracies and the factual inaccuracies and how they're just getting it wrong, and people will be like, this is bullshit. I'm not going to do that.
The other thing is that because it's all statistical and because it's all been, taken in from the entire web, what you have going on is what's called regression to the mean, meaning that the thing that you'll be seeing is the most likely thing. And usually that's not what you want, I would suggest, in a script. In other words, you want some surprises in there. You want some things that people say, oh, that's not what I expected, but yeah, that's cool. And you're not going to get that using this approach.
Okay, so I want to now talk about what could be coming. There's an expression that I've learned recently, to my regret, called quantum computing. Quantum computing is essentially looking between the ones and the zeros that will create an exponentially more powerful processor. And once that happens, you will have an AI that doesn't just take in 20,000 bytes of information in one swallow, a novel, but can take in the entire internet in one swallow. Then what the hell do we do? When quantum computing makes AI so much more powerful than it is now, are we basically looking at Terminator 2? Like what's coming?
I mean, quantum computing is also a little bit like fusion energy and other, like, it's always just about to come, and so it may not come, but it's useful as a thought exercise to say, like, okay, we didn't think we would be at this moment right now with large language models. It was a surprise to most of us that last November this thing happened. So we do need to be ready to think about, like, what's the stuff that could come after this. I think we reach like a threshold where it's really hard to imagine the world past that, because it just doesn't resemble our experience of the world very closely. Because if it can kind of do everything, what's left? Like, if all movies can just be sort of animated on the fly to create them and they look photorealistic, we don't know sort of what that looks like. And honestly, us talking about movies and TV is probably not. It's going to seem silly because the world around us is just going to feel so different, because these computers are going to be vastly powerful and feel intelligent by any measure we would be used to.
Yeah, but this circles back to something that you said earlier, Lisa, another word I learned, hypernormalization. Hypernormalization is the belief that mankind is inherently unwilling or unable to change giant things. In other words, in a recent poll of Americans, more Americans could picture the end of the world than could picture the end of capitalism, which is a bit of a head scratcher to me, right?
Yeah.
They believe that God has the power to end the world, but they don't believe that human beings could actually make a collective decision. We don't want to have capitalism anymore, whether you're a capitalist or not. It's telling about what people think. That's the idea of hypernormalization, and I think hypernormalization becomes an issue in this because I don't know that people believe that people will actually stop a force like this. But as you were saying, it may come down to how a couple decides to raise their kids, right? What is the role then of education to make sure that we are now going to educate a generation of people who will be able to deal with this as a part of everyday life and who will be responsible stewards for it and will understand where the landmines are? That's a question for anybody. Can we educate people in the way that we used to teach civics, and then we stopped? And 20 years later, Donald Trump became president, and we all seem so surprised. Yeah, of course, you don't teach people civics, you're going to get that guy.
Right.
Right? So what are the dangers of raising a generation of people who aren't inculcated in the human experience?
Yeah, I mean, I'd have to go back to what you were talking about, that old saying, garbage in, garbage out, right? So,
Right.
like, with the education, we can, hopefully we can learn about what it is, the threats, right? But not be paralyzed by it, right? And be able to try to be responsible enough to start to input more, like better data, and hopefully augment that algorithm to a certain point, hopefully, right? But that education is going to start with the next generation coming up and understand how to ethically use this and understand where they need to go to tap into that government. Because like you said, the capitalism is going to impact certain things making big adjustments, right? We know that's going to be a big problem. So if we can get down into the weeds of the educational part and taking our own responsibility and say, okay, how, like you said, it didn't affect you until you saw it come to the Writers Guild, right? That's right. So now, how are we now keeping this broader, larger conversation as it starts to sweep across every facet of our lives, you know?
Yeah, I think we really have to create more AI literacy. People have to be educated about, not necessarily that they're going to become Python programmers, but that they will understand what AI is, what it can do, what it can't do, and what the limitations, opportunities, the ethics of it are. There's a huge need for that. And I think one of the reasons why everybody has been so alarmed by things like ChatGPT is because for most of us, it pretty much totally caught us by surprise. And all of a sudden, there was this thing out there that, and then you read news reports that say, you know, this is threatening 25 different white-collar jobs or job classes. And we need to be able to respond to that appropriately and say, you know, really? And you know, what are the issues and what will be will there be new jobs that are created as a result of that? And part of the increasing AI literacy is we need to get all of us ready for the jobs of the 21st century. You know, the history of automation is, you know, lots of people talk about job loss. The actual experience is that the number of jobs don't necessarily get reduced, but the nature of the jobs often does change, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. But being ready for those jobs when they come along is going to be a function of having a much better educated populace.
There's a famous story about Walter Reuther. We're going to do questions right now. Famous story about Walter Reuther, who was the president of the UAW and had plenty of battles with what was then the big three, Ford, Chrysler, and GM, on behalf of his members. But he a uniquely powerful union president. And one day in 1954, he was touring a Ford plant in Cleveland with Henry Ford II, son of noted anti-Semite Henry Ford I. And they happened to come to a place in the line where there were some robots, machines, doing things that workers used to do. And Henry Ford II, because he was a prick, said to Walter Reuther, gee, Walter, I wonder how you're going to get union dues out of those machines. And Walter Reuther said, gee, Henry, I wonder how many of them are going to buy Fords. That's part of the issue with AI, right? We're going to smart ourselves into the grave if we're not careful. I want to turn it open to questions now. If you can, loud. If not, I'll just repeat it for you. Yes, sir.
So I got a question about opportunity and education. I run a middle school filmmaking program, and this summer, as a filmmaker, I've gotten so immersed in the power of AI, and it has been transformative personally. Like both of my films that have come out, we made on laptops. We distributed them basically from there, and we made money from there. And so what I've seen now is I can't approach teaching kids without enabling them to be creative within the AI. And so, but what the most important thing for me is giving those kids a cinematic vocabulary,
Right.
so they know what to tell the chat to do. So that, you know, if they want something inspired by Big Fish, they can do that. But they have to have seen Big Fish to know what that means. And so I see incredible opportunity because, you know, pretty novice filmmakers can all of a sudden create pretty sophisticated looking stuff that is reflective of what's in their imagination. And the tools are free. And so I'm just wondering where you guys see that as like, and I also was just at Hearst Castle and thinking about Orson Welles. And arguably always the best film ever made. Studio was not involved in that process. That was one man's vision, and that's what AI is now enabling these young people to do. So I'm wondering what you think about that as like, as AI kind of getting the studio out of the way and enabling the artists to really express themselves.
Anyone?
I work at the intersection of education, so and I think going back to what we talked about when he was talking about the body heat concept, that's sort of the opportunity for young people to have a bridge into AI, but on the backside of that, going back to the literacy, right? Let them know what's under the hood of those tools and saying, okay, you use this AI, but let me show you what it is and how it's being used, where it came from, and how you should think about using it as you move forward, right? So they can get the opportunity to create something and you say get that vocabulary, but it's a great opportunity to open up that bigger conversation for them to be responsible as they move forward during that process. So that's what I think, because it's an entertaining bridge, right, to AI literacy.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think that's such a good point, because now with our younger generation, they don't really understand how things work. We just get stuff automatically, magically. And I think if you do use that as an opportunity to really educate what AI is and where it's pulling from and who these people are who created these things, that's a wonderful way to get them to think more ethically about the use of AI and where it came from and how I can use it and how I can't. I think that's such a good
I
idea.
think like pretty pictures are one thing, because a lot of this comes down to, oh, it's a beautiful image. But what's the meaning behind it? What's the story? What's the emotion, right? And that's where I think the democratization, we all have amazing cameras on our phones. But does that mean we're making great content with it? I have like literally 10,000 photos on my phone right now. Most I'm never probably going to look at again. So I think to me, like in the educational process, is like the emotional content of Big Fish. It might just be the pictures, but what's actually under that hood, peeling that layer back, is we still have to teach writing and experience and emotion and narrative structure and all of that. Even if a computer's doing it, will it touch us? And that may sound a little pretentious, but it still seems to be the basis of it.
The only thing I'd push back a little bit against is that Citizen Kane may be Orson Welles' vision, it's one man's vision, but the actual execution of it was thousands of people working together. And I think filmmaking is a collective medium. It's storytelling brought together by a bunch of people. And so I'd want to make sure that whatever you're using your students to do, that there is a collaboration aspect of it, because it's not just being a prompt junkie and telling them what they want and now showing that result. It should be about how do we work together to make something that is a collective thing that we've done, to make sure you're not losing that with these new tools. I agree, just like when we had digital cameras for the first time, it just opened up the ability to do things that we couldn't do before. I went to film school and I still had to, cut Super 8 film. It was really tough.
I did too.
And so I don't miss film in that way, but I want to make sure we're not missing all the rest of the experience of making films, because that's what Film Independent is about, is not just a filmmaker being able to see their vision come to life, but also bringing a team of people to make that happen.